I watched them pour wine on a shivering puppy. I had no idea it belonged to the Mafia boss. The first splash of red wine hit the puppy across the face before I understood what I was seeing. He was a black Doberman, barely 5 months old, shivering beside an ice sculpture while 3 young men in tuxedos laughed over him. One tipped his glass again, and the puppy flinched so hard his silver collar rattled. In a ballroom full of crystal, money, and violin music, that terrified little sound cut through everything. I was supposed to be running the Winter Reserve auction in Canandaigua, not starting fights with donors' sons. But the moment that puppy tried to crawl under a linen-draped table, my job stopped mattering. I crossed the room, caught the wrist of the blonde one with the glass, and said, "Do that again, and I'll pour the whole bottle down your throat." His friends stopped laughing. The puppy looked at me like I had arrived 1 minute too late. Around us, the party kept sparkling, as if wealth could bleach cruelty clean. Older couples studied rare burgundy labels. A violinist played beside a wall of white roses. But inside our little circle, the air changed. The blonde man smiled the way spoiled men smile when they expect the world to punish anyone but them. "You work here," he said. "Remember that before you touch me again." I let go only so I could shrug off my coat. I wrapped the puppy inside my wool coat and felt his heart hammering against my arms. Wine had soaked his sleek fur, and he smelled of cold, fear, and something sour that made me want to cry and fight at the same time. One of the men muttered that it was just a dog. I told him helpless things are where character shows. 10 minutes later, that sentence cost me my job. I still think it was the best line I ever earned. My manager found me in the service corridor with the puppy bundled against my chest and the 3 young men talking over each other behind him. He did not ask what happened. He asked whether I knew who their fathers were. Then he said the hotel would fix everything if I apologized for causing a scene. I looked at the puppy's stained ears and said, "If this place needs me to apologize for stopping cruelty, then I never belonged here." I handed over my badge, my radio, and 4 years of dependable labor in less than a minute. The blonde one laughed. His friend raised a phone, probably hoping I would cry for his entertainment. I did not. I carried the puppy deeper into the quiet hallway, found warm towels, and started cleaning wine from his fur. That was when I noticed a man standing near the freight elevator, watching in complete silence, snow melting from the shoulders of his dark coat. He was tall, broad, and still in the way dangerous men often are. He did not interrupt me. He just stood there, gloves in one hand, observing everything. If you believe a person's heart is revealed by how they treat something defenseless, press like and subscribe now, because that shaking puppy led me straight into the most dangerous love of my life. And by the time I understood whose dog I was holding, my ordinary future was already gone. A few minutes later, security asked me to stay and give a statement. Before I could refuse, the man from the hallway stepped beside them and said, "She won't be leaving alone." That was how I first heard the name Lorenzo Viscari. The security chief said it with the kind of respect that sounds a lot like fear. Everybody within driving distance of Rochester knew the name, even if polite people pretended they didn't. Lorenzo owned shipping companies, vineyards, construction firms, and enough dark rumors to fill a newspaper archive. I looked from the security chief to him and tightened my hold on the puppy. "If you're another owner who thinks animals are props," I said, "you picked the wrong night." He surprised me by kneeling instead of answering. Right there on the marble floor, in his expensive coat and polished shoes, he went down on one knee and said only one word: "Otis." The puppy raised his head but would not move. Lorenzo did not reach for him. He rested one gloved hand on the floor and waited. That patience disturbed me more than anger would have. Monsters are easier when they act like monsters. After a long moment, Lorenzo looked up at me and said, "Thank you for standing between him and cowards." Then he studied the wine stains on Otis's fur, the scratch on my wrist, and the towel in my hand, and something in his face turned cold. "Who did it?" he asked. I told him I wanted the truth preserved, not polished. He said, "The truth is the only reason I am still here." So I gave my account once to hotel security and once again to Lorenzo in a small office off the lobby. He never interrupted. When I finished, he asked only whether anyone else had stepped in before me. I said no. He nodded like a man confirming the worst thing he already suspected. I refused his offer of a ride home because favors from powerful men tend to grow roots. Lorenzo did not argue. He handed me a plain business card with a number and said, "Frightened dogs sometimes stop eating after the danger passes." "If Otis shuts down," he said, "my veterinarian may need to call you. Tonight he trusts you more than he trusts me." I expected that to be the end of it. By the next morning, I knew better. My former manager called and offered me a chance to repair the misunderstanding if I signed a statement admitting I had overreacted to harmless drunken teasing. I laughed and hung up. An hour later, Salvatore Bellucci appeared on my porch with flowers so costly they looked obscene against the peeling paint. His son, he said, had gone too far in jest. He offered 3 months' wages, then gently hinted that independent event work can become scarce when important families are displeased. I told him his flowers were wasting cold air. The smile left his face. "You're making yourself memorable," he said. I answered, "So was your son." After he drove away, Lorenzo called from the number on the card. He did not ask whether anyone had visited me. He asked what Bellucci had worn. When I said camel coat and blue tie with gold pheasants, he went quiet for a second. Then he said, "You notice details. Liars hate that." He asked me to repeat my statement once more. I met him at one of his vineyard offices, a low stone building overlooking rows of sleeping winter vines. He had already spoken separately to the 3 young men and to each of their fathers. Every version was different. In one story, Otis had startled them. In another, wine spilled accidentally while they were trying to help. Lorenzo laid the statements on the table and let me read them. By the 3rd page, I was angrier than I had been in the ballroom. "They aren't protecting boys," I said. "They're protecting cruelty because cruelty lives close to power." Lorenzo leaned back and watched me with that unreadable stillness of his. He asked whether I would say the same thing in front of every man who could make my life harder. I told him I had already lost my job for saying less. Something shifted in his face then. Not softness exactly, more like respect finding a place to sit. When our meeting ended, Otis began whining from the next room. The moment a guard opened the door, the puppy stumbled toward me on 2 big paws and pressed himself to my legs. Lorenzo said the veterinarian had examined him twice. Physically, he was fine. Emotionally, he was refusing food and sleeping badly. I should have stepped back. Instead, I knelt and stroked Otis's ears until the trembling eased. Some creatures ask for help in a language that goes straight past caution. Lorenzo asked whether I would spend a few afternoons helping Otis settle. He offered payment. I refused it. He offered a driver. I refused that too. In the end, we agreed on the only arrangement I could tolerate. I would come on my own schedule, drive myself, help the dog, and owe no one gratitude except the animal who had started this whole mess. Lorenzo accepted my terms without complaint, which should not have impressed me as much as it did. The Viscari estate outside Rochester was grand, but not in the way I expected. Yes, there were gates and guards and enough stone to build a monastery, but there were also heated barns, old maples wrapped for winter, and a row of cottages where retired staff still lived. On my first visit, an elderly woman in a green cardigan opened the side door and introduced herself as June Carver. "He keeps calling me retired," she whispered, "but then who would correct the cook?" June liked Lorenzo, and that unsettled me. Older people rarely waste trust on the wrong person for long. She told me she had worked for the Viscari family for decades and still lived on the estate because Lorenzo thought old loyalty deserved warm floors, good soup, and freedom from landlords. She said it casually, as if such consideration were ordinary. I had expected fear under this roof. Instead, I kept finding signs of private care, as if kindness here was practiced quietly and without witnesses. Otis improved fastest when Lorenzo stayed near but did not force contact. In the library, while I sat on the rug feeding the puppy bits of chicken, Lorenzo worked at a long desk by the windows. He took calls in a voice like locked steel. Yet every time Otis startled, Lorenzo lowered his tone, ended a call, or crossed the room only far enough to set down water before retreating again. He had the discipline to let a frightened creature choose him in its own time. Contradictions kept gathering around him. Men who looked built for violence guarded the grounds, yet in the greenhouse I found 3 injured owls recovering before transport to a wildlife center Lorenzo quietly funded. In the kitchen, he knew which driver's mother needed surgery and which gardener's wife had arthritis. He was not soft, and I never mistook him for soft. But his care was exact, private, and consistent, which made him far harder to dismiss than the rumors had prepared me for. On my 4th visit, I bent to lift a crate of supplies, and a blade of pain cut through the right side of my head so sharply I had to grip the table. For a second, the greenhouse tilted. When the room steadied, Lorenzo was beside me. He did not touch me until I nodded. "Migraine?" he asked. I said yes because it was easier than the truth, and because the truth still felt like the last room in my life with a locked door. Later, as I put on my coat, a prescription bottle slid partway from my bag. Lorenzo noticed, because Lorenzo noticed everything. He did not ask what it was. He only held the door open and said my car had been warmed. That small mercy almost undid me. I sat behind the wheel afterward with both hands trembling, angry that a man I should probably fear was becoming the person most likely to see through me, and more frightened still that I wanted him to. Losing the hotel job hurt faster than pride could hide. Calls went unanswered. Regional event work depends on references, and suddenly mine had become slippery. I picked up bookkeeping at a marina office, coordinated 2 church luncheons, and sold a bracelet my mother had left me, even though I had promised myself I never would. I told no one at the estate. Pride can become foolish, but when you live alone and pay every bill yourself, pride is sometimes the thin wall holding the roof up. Lorenzo found out anyway, not because he questioned me, but because June innocently mentioned I had skipped lunch to meet a florist about a small job. 2 days later, a winery association called to offer 3 spring events on independent contract. The hours fit my medical appointments. The pay was fair. Lorenzo never admitted arranging it, which is exactly how I knew he had. The next time I thanked him, I did it with enough annoyance to make June hide a smile in her teacup. We were in the training yard with Otis chasing a rag lure when I said, "I don't need rescuing." Lorenzo kept his eyes on the dog. "Good," he answered. "I'm not interested in rescuing women who are perfectly capable of threatening people with wine bottles." I laughed before I could stop myself. He turned then, and the air shifted between us. A week later, during a sleet storm, Otis slipped his lead and bolted toward the lower orchard, and whatever cautious distance remained between us ended there. I found the puppy wedged under a split-rail fence, whining while freezing rain slicked his ears. I knelt in the mud to coax him out and lost my footing on the icy slope. Lorenzo reached us seconds later. He dropped to the ground in a coat worth more than my rent, braced my shoulders until I could stand, then tucked Otis inside his overcoat. He noticed my soaked gloves, took my hands, and pressed them against the warm wool over the puppy's back while we climbed uphill together. That night, June insisted I stay for supper because the roads were turning dangerous. We ate in a family dining room, not the formal one, with stew, thick bread, and the kind of butter that makes people forgive whole generations. 2 drivers joined us, along with a groundskeeper and June's widowed sister. Nobody performed for Lorenzo. He asked about a grandson's army paperwork, solved a furnace problem before dessert, and listened when June scolded him for forgetting lunch. I had never seen power worn so quietly. Attraction would have been simpler if it were only physical. Of course he was handsome in that severe, weathered way some men become after years of carrying too much. Of course his voice could unsettle good judgment. But what drew me deeper were smaller things. How he slowed for older people, how he never interrupted women, how Otis slept harder when Lorenzo was in the room. The safest moments of my week had started happening in a house I once thought I should avoid. The second medical scare came at a charity supper in Geneva. Bright lights and too much noise hit me all at once, and I spent 10 minutes locked in a restroom stall, waiting for the world to stop tilting. I thought I had hidden it. That night, a car appeared outside my cottage with a container of June's soup and a note in Lorenzo's handwriting that said, "Eat this. Your migraines are winning by points." I read it 5 times before I let myself smile. When I saw him next, I returned the container and tried to keep my tone light. He took one look at me and said, "You are lying to me about something important." There was no accusation in it, which made it worse. I told him everybody is entitled to one locked drawer in life. He answered, "Yes, but the people who care about you eventually hear what rattles inside it." I went home shaken by tenderness, which is a ridiculous way to discover you are falling in love. Not all dangers stayed outside our orbit. Rumors began moving through the contractor circles where I worked. I was unstable, difficult, prone to scenes. June later confirmed Vincent Bellucci had been repeating my name in clubs with a grin. I wanted to confront him in public. Lorenzo told me, not yet. I hated being told what to do, but I also knew he was right. So instead of waiting to be buried by gossip, I did the more exhausting thing and built something of my own. I registered a small event company, borrowed folding tables from a cousin in Auburn, and started taking bookings the grand hotels considered too small to matter. Church anniversaries, fire hall fundraisers, a birding society luncheon by the lake. Lorenzo never offered to bankroll me. He sent work only when it fit and kept his name away from it. That restraint earned more trust than a grand gesture would have. He was learning how to stand beside me without turning help into ownership. By early spring, Otis had outgrown his frightened silence. He became all long legs, sharp ears, and sudden bursts of ridiculous dignity. He followed me like a shadow, and Lorenzo like a soldier. Watching the two of them together became one of my favorite private weaknesses. Lorenzo trained him the way he seemed to do most things, without wasted motion, without shouting, without bluffing. Otis learned that safety and discipline could live in the same pair of hands. So, unfortunately for me, did I. The first time Lorenzo kissed me, we were standing at the quiet lakeside inlet where migratory birds rested during spring. Otis was nose-deep in reeds, and Lorenzo was explaining which species June secretly fed all winter, despite claiming otherwise. I laughed, turned toward him, and found his gaze already waiting. "May I?" he asked. That simple question undid me. Men with his kind of power do not usually ask permission for anything. I said yes before I could retreat behind fear. The kiss itself was warm, deliberate, and almost painfully careful. Otis sneezed beside us, offended by the delay in his walk, and we both laughed like younger people. After that, affection grew the way honest things usually do, through repetition more than spectacle. Shared suppers, hands brushing at doorways, long talks about family, birds, weather, loyalty, and every safe subject circling the dangerous one I refused to name. Love did not strike like lightning. It gathered like weather and finally became impossible to deny. My illness, of course, did not care that I had finally met the right man at the wrong time. A follow-up scan in Rochester confirmed progression despite treatment. The tumor had returned in tissue already scarred by earlier surgery and radiation from years before. More treatment might buy time, but not the sort that people build old age around. I drove home with both hands numb on the wheel and spent half an hour in my parked car before I could make myself walk inside. That same week, Lorenzo casually asked whether I preferred summer by the lake or early autumn in the Finger Lakes, because he was considering adding a small guest house near the bird sanctuary and wanted my opinion on the windows. I answered too quickly that I never planned that far ahead. Silence settled between us. He did not push. He only changed the subject and later sent me home with tomato soup from June, as if soup might cover the shape of all the questions he was choosing not to ask. June saw more than either of us admitted. One afternoon, she folded towels beside me and said, "You look like a woman borrowing happiness from a library book she knows is already overdue." I nearly dropped what I was holding. Old women can aim truth with unnerving accuracy. I asked whether Lorenzo had said anything. She shook her head. "He doesn't talk when he hurts," she said. "He becomes quieter. That's worse for the rest of us." After that, even my happiness felt timed. The reckoning inside Lorenzo's organization began at a spring dinner I was never meant to witness. I was leaving through a side corridor after discussing menus when I heard his voice from the smaller dining hall. Calm, level, impossible to ignore. He was speaking to Salvatore Bellucci and the other fathers, laying out each lie they had told about the auction night. Timestamps, camera angles, staff statements, valet records. He had built the truth piece by piece and now had them trapped inside it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I stopped just beyond the doorway and heard Salvatore say his son was being condemned over a dog. Lorenzo answered, "No. Your son is being judged for pleasure taken in helplessness. You are being judged for the lie you chose afterward." Then he stripped the three sons of any future role in his business and removed their fathers from authority they had spent decades gathering. No shouting, no theatrics, just a permanent, humiliating closing of doors. It was terrifying, and it was deserved. When Lorenzo found me in the corridor afterward, I expected anger. He looked tired more than angry. "Now you know what I am when rules are broken," he said. I answered honestly. "I knew you were dangerous. I didn't know you were fair." He looked at me for a long time and said, "Fairness is expensive in my world. That is why so few men choose it." That was the moment I understood how badly I could be hurt by losing him. Vincent Bellucci did not accept humiliation gracefully. 2 weeks later, one of my church clients canceled after an anonymous tip claimed I skimmed deposits. The lie collapsed within a day because I keep cleaner books than banks do, but the message was clear. I could have carried that problem straight to Lorenzo. Instead, I drove to the church myself, laid out every receipt across a fellowship hall table, and cleared my name face to face. Lorenzo heard about it afterward and was furious anyway. "You think courage means standing alone every time," he told me in the greenhouse that evening. "Sometimes it means letting loyal people stand with you." I told him loyalty bought by fear was not something I intended to borrow. He stepped closer, no anger left now, only gravity. "Then borrow mine," he said, "because it is given, not bought." That was the moment I knew I had become essential to him, and knowing it made the future I was hiding feel even crueler. From then on, ordinary days carried the weight of all we were not saying. We walked Otis through wet spring fields. Lorenzo remembered absurd details about me, the pear jam I liked with toast, the way loud music sharpened my headaches, the fact that I always read menu cards from bottom to top when I was nervous. Love did not arrive with dramatic declarations. It arrived through accurate observation, through being known carefully, through discovering that someone had started arranging his life around your unspoken comfort. Then came the day my body betrayed me in front of him. Otis had stolen a pheasant feather in the lower orchard, and I bent to pull it from his mouth just as the world split with dizziness. When I opened my eyes, I was on a bench in the potting shed with Lorenzo kneeling in front of me, and panic locked so tightly behind his face it almost looked like anger. There was blood where I had bitten my lip. My left hand would not stop shaking. "Enough," he said. "No more migraines. No more half answers." He steadied me only enough to keep me upright. "Tell me the doctor. Tell me the medication. Tell me who has convinced you to carry this alone." I almost did. God help me, I almost laid the whole failing future in his hands right there. But I had already imagined what would happen if he knew. Lorenzo would move surgeons, nurses, planes, money, and half the state if he thought any of it could buy me time. He would call that devotion. I would call it watching him bleed out beside me for a war neither of us could win. So I swallowed the truth and told him it was an old neurological issue that sometimes flared under stress. He did not believe me, but he respected my refusal more than most men respect honesty. A week later, Vincent Bellucci's remaining contracts disappeared in 3 counties. 2 foremen who had smeared my name were removed, and Salvatore's influence shrank overnight. Lorenzo had chosen his answer. I need to say something plain here. Lorenzo's world was criminal, even when his private tenderness was real. Loving him did not erase that. I never pretended otherwise. But I had also seen polished men in tuxedos laugh while a puppy shook under wine, and I had seen Lorenzo punish that cruelty when doing so cost his own side power. Real life does not sort souls as neatly as polite people like to believe. Sometimes the darkest man in the room is still the one who stands up first. If you were in my place, loving a man who would spend his whole soul trying to save you, knowing there was no saving to be had, would you tell him the truth and let him watch you fade? Or would you leave while he still had enough anger left to survive you? Hold that answer close, because what I did next is the only choice from my life I still cannot remember without feeling my heart turn against itself. The evening Lorenzo asked me to stay began quietly. Rain tapped the library windows. June was visiting her sister. Otis, now nearly grown, slept at our feet. Lorenzo poured tea instead of wine because he knew strong reds worsened my headaches. Then he set his cup down and said he was tired of pretending our life together was temporary when every part of him had already made its decision. He wanted me there. Not visiting, not half hidden, there beside him as the shape of his future. He did not offer jewels or contracts. He offered practical things that somehow felt more intimate. A room facing the lake because morning light there was gentle. Space for my files beside his desk if I wanted it. Warm floors in winter. Quiet summers near the bird sanctuary. Then his voice roughened in a way I had never heard before. "Rachel," he said, "I am asking for the rest, however much of it we are given." That almost destroyed me on the spot. I wanted to say yes. That is the part people always underestimate when they look back on choices like mine. I wanted the lake room, the warm floors, the man who noticed when I skipped lunch and when smiling cost me effort. I wanted grocery lists, muddy dog paws, and stupid ordinary years. Instead, I looked at the future he was offering and saw hospital corridors inside it, seizures, wheelchairs, and a powerful man discovering there was one enemy he could not threaten into retreat. "I love you," I told him. It was the first time I had said it aloud. His eyes closed for half a second, as if the sound itself mattered. Then I finished the sentence that shattered us both. "But I cannot stay." He did not shout. He asked only one question. "Is it my world?" That mercy nearly broke my resolve. If he had been cruel, leaving would have been easier. I shook my head and whispered, "No, it's me." He understood only enough to be hurt, not enough to be warned. "Tell me the part you are refusing to say," he said. I could not. Speech had become dangerous. After a long silence, he stood, walked to the window, then returned and helped me into my coat as carefully as ever. "If you choose the door, Rachel," he said, "no one in this house will lock it." That was when I knew I had loved him correctly, and that knowledge made leaving feel like violence. I left before dawn 2 days later. I arranged work near my sister Elise in Vermont, rented a small place attached to a hospice outreach program, and instructed my lawyer to hold one sealed letter until after my death. That sounds cold when said plainly. It did not feel cold. It felt like cutting off my own hand to keep the rest of me from reaching back. Lorenzo could have found me within hours if he chose. He did not. He honored what he did not understand. Once, 3 weeks after I left, a package arrived with no return card. Inside was Otis's canvas duck, repaired where he had chewed it open, and a bag of the tea June served on rainy nights. No note, nothing that could be answered. That was worse than pleading would have been. By late summer, my strength was failing for good. The headaches sharpened. My left hand forgot what it held. Stares became negotiations. Elise tried to be cheerful, but sisters carry too much history to pretend well. On better mornings, I sat on her porch facing the green mountains and thought about the lakeside inlet where geese rose from reeds while Lorenzo slowed his step so Otis would not splash them. I wrote the letter in pieces because no one sitting could contain that much love and cowardice together. The first page took all afternoon. On it, I told him what I should have said months earlier. Before the auction, before Otis, before us, I had already been told the cancer was back and no cure remained. Years earlier, surgeons had cut it out once and radiation had chased the edges. This time, the edges had returned hungry. I wrote that the auction mattered because terminal news strips politeness from certain choices. When those young men poured wine over a shivering puppy, I remember thinking that I was done spending any remaining strength protecting rich sons from the truth of what they were. Time had become expensive. I was not going to waste it pretending cruelty was merely rude. I told him every lie in order because love deserves honest bookkeeping. The migraines were never simple migraines. The pills in my bag were anti-seizure medication and steroids. The sudden trips to Rochester were neuro-oncology appointments. The fatigue that made me leave dinners early was not fear of his associates. The reason I refused to discuss next summer was that one specialist had already advised me not to make promises to a calendar I might never reach. Those were the facts. I owed him all of them. Then I wrote the hardest truth. I had not left because I doubted him. I had left because I knew him. A man who could reorganize whole industries to punish a lie about a frightened dog would have torn apart heaven and earth to keep me alive. He would have slept in hospital chairs, bullied surgeons, memorized medication charts, and called it a privilege while it hollowed him. I could not bear the idea of my ending becoming the center of his remaining life. That does not mean I was noble. I was selfish, too. I wanted to preserve the version of us that still glowed in memory. His coat around my shoulders in the sleet, his hand open on the library armrest while Otis dreamed at our feet, his absurd note ordering me to eat soup, his face turned toward migrating birds as if wonder could still reach a feared man. I wanted to remain the woman he kissed by the lake, not the patient whose suffering reorganized every hour of his day. I told him rescuing Otis had given me something medicine never could. It returned me to myself at the exact moment illness was beginning to reduce me to scans, side effects, and pity. Through that frightened puppy, I met a man who saw me whole. Not brave, not tragic, not inspirational. Whole. Whatever history says about Lorenzo Vascari, that is the truth I would die defending. He noticed the living woman inside me when disease was already trying to erase her. I also wrote that he had taught me something about power. Not the kind newspapers fear, though that was real enough. I meant the quieter kind, the choice to kneel instead of dominate, the discipline to wait for a terrified creature to approach on its own, the refusal to excuse cruelty in your own people because they are your own. Those lessons mattered because illness had left me feeling powerless, and loving him reminded me that character can still be chosen even when outcomes cannot. By the final pages, my hand shook so badly, Elise had to steady the paper. I asked Lorenzo for 3 things only. First, do not avenge me on anyone. There was no villain left to punish except biology. Second, keep June warm, nosy, and impossible for as many years as heaven allows. Third, if it would not wound him too much, create veterinary help for families who love their animals but cannot afford emergencies. I knew he would understand exactly why that mattered. I did not ask him to wait for me in grief. Love that chains the living is only vanity wearing perfume. Instead, I asked him to continue where he was strongest, in the parts of his life that protected what was vulnerable without advertising the fact. Keep the sanctuary alive. Keep old promises. Let Otis grow heavy, spoiled, and certain he is adored. And once every spring, if it does not cut too deeply, take him to the inlet and think of the woman who told the truth too late. The lawyer promised the envelope would not be released until there was no chance of Lorenzo abandoning everything to come after me. I signed that instruction myself. Death, I learned, is not only fear. It is paperwork, timing, and deciding which truth becomes a burden for the people you leave. Mine would arrive late, carrying explanation only after it could no longer change action. That delay was the last protection I knew how to offer the man I loved most. In September, when walking became uncertain, Elise wheeled me onto the porch at dusk and read old travel magazines aloud because ordinary subjects felt soothing. I listened badly. My mind kept returning to Rochester, to the estate drive lined with maples, to the library windows blurred by rain. Somewhere, I imagined, Otis slept near Lorenzo's chair. Somewhere, June was correcting a cook. Somewhere, a man who hated unanswered questions was living inside the one I had left behind. If you've stayed with me this long, and if Otis, Lorenzo, and one stubborn woman from Canandaigua have earned a place in your heart, press like and subscribe before I finish. Not for me. For every small act of mercy that looks foolish in public and turns out to change a whole life in private. Those acts are rarer than people think, and they deserve witnesses. I do not know whether Lorenzo opened the letter in his office, in the library, or by the lake. I only know how he reads pain, standing first, sitting only when the weight of it demands. So when I imagine the moment, I see Otis resting his head against Lorenzo's knee, while page after page undoes every wrong conclusion. Not that I feared his name, not that I rejected his love, that I loved him enough to spare him my ending, even if he never forgave the method. I imagine him reaching the page where I confessed I had wanted to say yes that rainy night, because that was the deepest wound of all. I wanted the room by the lake, the shared desk, the repaired dog toys, the quiet winters, and the foolish ordinary future of groceries and curtains and old arguments over nothing. Knowing I would not have it is what sent me away. Some griefs are born not from what ends, but from the life that opens and still cannot be taken. And because he is Lorenzo, I imagine the understanding arriving without shattered glass or shouted orders. Just that terrible stillness of a strong man learning there had been one enemy he truly could not fight. In time, I think he would do what he always did after honest loss. He would continue. He would keep the sanctuary running, keep older workers protected, keep liars far from power. Love would not make him gentler than truth allowed. It would make him more exact. Maybe by the following spring he would carry my letter to the inlet and read it again with Otis beside him while geese folded down through cloudy light. Maybe he would smile despite himself at June's name underlined twice, or hear my voice in the line about soup. Maybe he would create that veterinary fund quietly, without attaching the Vescari name, because the best things he ever did were the ones he never used to purchase public forgiveness. That would be exactly like him. As for me, I left this world with no illusions about fairness. I was not granted enough years. Lorenzo was not granted enough warning. Otis was not granted a harmless first night. But I was granted one clear chance to act when it mattered, one creature worth protecting, and one love fierce enough to force me into the cruelest mercy I knew. It was not the ending I wanted. It was still an ending worth telling. So if you ever see someone laugh at fear because the victim cannot fight back, do not look away the way that ballroom did. Step forward. Lift the shaking creature. Risk the job, the invitation, the polished room, the powerful surname. I did, and it cost me almost everything familiar. It also led me to Otis, to Lorenzo, and to the last honest chapter of my life. Tell me in the comments as we part, would you have stayed and told him, or loved him enough to leave?